What's up, people? You recognize this setup? No? Exactly. Because I'm in college, baby. And I'm guessing that kind of explains why I've been away for so long. Sorry about that, but I'm back, at least for this video. Anyways, you probably clicked on this video because you are stuck somewhere along your art journey. Well, don't worry, that's what we're here to fix. In this video, we're going to be talking about some of the things that you can do to help keep your momentum going and improve at art. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to demonstrate all of the points that I'm going to be talking about in this video with something that I personally struggle with myself in terms of art, of course. So without further ado, let's get into it. Step number one is going to be incredibly easy because it doesn't really require that much effort, at least for most people. Step one is to pinpoint exactly what your weakness is. Now by weakness, I mean something that you struggle with drawing or painting or illustrating in any way. You might struggle with anatomy or perspective or drawing hands or, you know, things of that nature. Could be anything, really. In my case, I struggle a lot with drawing buildings and modern architectures. That stuff, that is not for me. But I really want to improve at drawing them. So for step one, that'd be my answer. Buildings. Step two would be to identify a good reference for the thing that you're trying to learn how to draw. I've always said this in every single one of my videos. Always use references. They are by far the best resource that you have at your disposal when you're trying to improve at drawing. So just go on Pinterest, search up what you're trying to draw, and find a good reference. But hold on, before you do that, I want to ask you a quick question. Do you know how to actually identify a good reference? Like if I had to ask you, like, what do you think makes a reference good? Would you be able to answer that question? Well, you might have an idea, but most probably you wouldn't be able to put it into words, at least without thinking about it, you know? Well, if I'm being honest, the question is pretty subjective because it mostly depends on your opinion. So I have here a couple of points that you can just keep in mind when you're looking at references. So if you're just surfing on Pinterest, you find something that catches your attention and it checks out on all of these aspects that I'm about to mention, then you can be sure that, at least in my book, it's a good reference. So, what makes a reference a good reference? Well, first of all, this is probably the most important thing, is that the reference that you're using matches your skill level in art. Again, skill level is also something that is very, very, very subjective. But you know what I mean. When you look at a reference, you can tell pretty quickly if you can or cannot draw the thing in the reference. For example, I struggle a lot with drawing modern architecture. So when I go on Pinterest to look for references of buildings, obviously I'm not going to pick something like this. I'm going to pick something that's much simpler and has a lot less details to it, like this. And over time, I'll work my way up, increasing the level of complexity with each reference until I can eventually draw architecture like we saw in the first reference. What I'm trying to say is that it's a skill that you build up gradually over time. So the reference that you pick has to match your skill level. But there's a flip side to this. You also should not pick a reference that is too easy for you. You should try to pick references that fall slightly outside your comfort zone. Let's say you struggle a lot with foreshortening. You would obviously have to avoid picking such an extreme reference like this one because, you know, it probably doesn't fall within your skill level. But again, you would also have to avoid picking a reference that is too easy for you. Something like this, for example. You have to find a sweet spot between each of these two references that makes it so that the thing that you're trying to draw is not too difficult, but it's also not too easy. With foreshortening, the most common difficulty to overcome is overlap and perspective. So you could pick something like this. In this reference, there isn't that much overlap. Well, there is a bit, but then again, it has to be slightly outside our comfort zone. So there is a tiny bit of overlap and the perspective is not very extreme, but it's still not that easy to draw, if you know what I mean. I hope you could kind of understand what I was talking about. Number two is a bit obvious and self-explanatory, but a good reference is good when it aligns with your artistic goal. If you're trying to learn how to draw anatomy, you should look at anatomy references. If you are like me and you want to learn how to draw buildings, you have to look at references of buildings. It's a bit obvious, but I just felt like I needed to put that out there. Last thing that I have listed here is that your reference has to be interesting or dynamic in some way. Now, to call back on a reference that I showed earlier in the video, this reference is kind of cool, right? It has a cool pose, it has some foreshortening, but you know, something about it is just a bit too boring, you know? I would much rather go with a reference like this. It's a bit more dynamic and it's a bit more interesting, if you catch my drift. The perspective is a bit more interesting. There is still some foreshortening. The body is twisting in a much more interesting and dynamic way. so I would say that this reference is better than the previous one. However, like we said, it's all opinion based. It really just varies from artist to artist. But that just about does it for step 2, which, if you forgot, it's identifying a good reference. Now, step 3 is to practice deconstruction. Most of you probably already know what I'm talking about, but if you don't, maybe you're a little bit of a newer artist. Basically, you have to break down the element that you're trying to draw into 3D shapes. That's right, 3D. Even some more seasoned artists get this wrong. When I watch some videos on YouTube on drawing from reference, they usually include a demonstration of a reference in their video, but they deconstruct it in 2D shapes, which is so weird to me, because the purpose of deconstructing the object into 3D shapes is so that you can envision it for yourself and be able to recreate it without depending on a reference in the future. But when you deconstruct a reference down into just 2D shapes, oftentimes they form such irregular shapes that it would be pretty impossible for you to try and come up with something like that on the fly with no reference. You know what I mean? Start practicing this if you haven't. If you have, keep practicing this. I guarantee you it will pay off at the very end. So let's take a look at one of the previous references that I showed in the video. This girl, right here. I'll give a demonstration of what I mean when I say to deconstruct the element or the subject into 3D shapes. This is pretty much as far as I'd go in terms of deconstruction. Of course, I tried to keep my sketch as clean as possible so that you guys can understand while you're watching at home. Normally, I would not clean up my sketch this much, but this is what I mean by deconstruction. Breaking the subject down into its most simple 3D forms. You can see here on the sides, I listed like the shapes that I use to replicate the subject that I saw on the reference. I used a sphere with a head, shoulders, and joints. Well, I guess shoulders do count as joints, but you know what I mean. I used boxes for the rib cage and the pelvis, and I used cylinders for the limbs. Now, unfortunately, I made my sketch a little bit too low on the paper, but this still serves to get my point across. Finally, after you're done deconstructing your subject into basic 3D shapes, that's when you start to add the details. Now, I can't really teach you how to add details because, you know, you might be trying to learn something completely different like me, like drawing buildings, in which case me adding details to this would be useless to you, right? So that's where you kind of have to do a little bit of research on your own to try and figure out what details to put where. But regardless, I hope the tips that I shared were at least a little bit helpful.
Are you subscribed? You better be subscribed, or else I am going to murder. No, but in all seriousness, if you've watched this far into the video, then you're obviously enjoying the content. So why not do me and you a favor and subscribe so that you can help me deal with my crippling self-esteem, and so that you will never miss an upload. Because God knows I have the most abysmal upload schedule ever. Anyways, let's get into this demonstration. So, in this piece, both of my vanishing points are out of the page, so I have to set up a perspective grid using something called the Brewer method, which honestly would be too much of a long story to explain in this video. I spent a lot of time planning out my measurements and my perspective lines because honestly that's what makes or breaks these kinds of pieces. I went in with the details with a free hand instead of just using the ruler because I think that would have felt more organic. Plus, if you look in the reference again, the house is kind of decaying and there are many imperfections in the brickwork. So I felt like going freehand would kind of help mimic that in my own piece. Then I did some basic shading with my standard 2B Faber-Castell pencil. Honestly, I'm not too happy with the result, but again, considering that I did say that I struggle a lot with drawing building and practically anything that has to do with perspective, I'd say this piece came out pretty alright. Thank you so much for making it to the end of the video, I appreciate you. Watch this next video to see the single best piece of advice that I can offer to a beginner artist.